Let's travel back to India in 1857, a time when the subcontinent was a mosaic of diverse cultures, languages, and traditions, each contributing to the rich tapestry of Indian society. The land was vibrant with festivals, music, and a deep sense of history that stretched back thousands of years. A land of many cultures and a long, rich history. From the majestic Himalayas in the north to the serene backwaters of Kerala in the south, India was a land of contrast and unity. The people were proud of their heritage and their way of life, but it was ruled by the British East India Company. They were very strict. The company had established its dominance through a combination of military might and shrewd diplomacy, exploiting the internal divisions among Indian states. The British imposed heavy taxes and strict laws, which created widespread discontent among the Indian populace. Indians really wanted to be free. The desire for independence was growing stronger with each passing day. The common people, the farmers, the artisans, and even the soldiers in the British Army were feeling the weight of oppression. They yearned for a life where they could live with dignity and self-respect. Then something happened that started a big fight for freedom, a spark that would ignite the flames of rebellion. It was a small incident, but it had far-reaching consequences. The discontent that had been simmering for years finally found an outlet. It all began with a rumor that spread like wildfire among the Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, in the British Army. The rumor was about the new Enfield rifles that the soldiers were required to use. The new rifles used bullets greased with animal fat. This was deeply offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. For Hindus, the use of cow fat was sacrilegious, while for Muslims, pig fat was equally unacceptable. The soldiers were required to bite off the ends of these greased cartridges, which was against their religious beliefs. This was against what Hindu and Muslim soldiers believed. It was very disrespectful. The soldiers felt that their faith and dignity were being trampled upon by the British authorities. This act of insensitivity became the tipping point for the brewing discontent. One of these soldiers was Mangal Pandey. He was very brave. Mangal Pandey, a sepoy in the 34th Bengal Native Infantry, became a symbol of resistance. His courage and defiance inspired many others to stand up against the British. He refused to use the bullets. His refusal was not just an act of defiance, but a statement of his unwavering commitment to his beliefs and his country. Mangal Pandey's actions were a catalyst for the larger movement that was about to unfold. He stood up to the British. His bravery in the face of certain punishment galvanized other soldiers and civilians alike. The spirit of rebellion was contagious, and it spread rapidly among the ranks of the sepoys. Other soldiers saw this and joined him. The rebellion quickly gained momentum, as more and more soldiers refused to follow orders and took up arms against their British commanders. The unity among the sepoys was a powerful force that the British had not anticipated. The rebellion spread very quickly. From Meerut to Delhi, Kanpur to Lucknow, Indians fought back. The uprising was not confined to a single region, but spread across the northern and central parts of India. Each city and town became a battleground where the Indian soldiers and civilians fought valiantly against the British forces. Rani Lakshmibai, the Queen of Jhansi, became a symbol of resistance. Her leadership and valor were legendary. She donned the armor of a warrior and led her troops into battle, becoming an icon of courage and determination. She was a strong warrior and fought bravely against the British. Her courage inspired many. Rani Lakshmibai's story became a rallying cry for the freedom fighters. Her sacrifice and heroism were etched into the collective memory of the Indian people. This fight is called the First War of Independence. It marked the beginning of a long and arduous struggle for freedom. The events of 1857 were a turning point in Indian history, laying the foundation for future movements against British rule. Sadly, the British were too strong and stopped the rebellion. The superior military strength and resources of the British eventually quelled the uprising. The rebels faced brutal reprisals, and many were executed or imprisoned. But something important had changed. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and the spirit of resistance could not be extinguished. The people of India had tasted the possibility of freedom, and there was no turning back. The uprising of 1857 showed how strong the Indian people were. It demonstrated their resilience and their willingness to fight for their rights. The unity displayed during the rebellion was a testament to the strength of the Indian spirit. It showed the world that Indians would not give up easily. The events of 1857 captured the attention of the international community, highlighting the injustices faced by the Indian people and their determination to overcome them. The desire for freedom had started to grow. The rebellion planted the seeds of nationalism and a collective identity among the Indian people. The dream of an independent India began to take root in the hearts and minds of the populace. It was only a matter of time before India would be free. The struggle for independence would continue for many more years, but the spirit of 1857 would live on, inspiring future generations to fight for their freedom and dignity. In the late 1800s, more and more people in India wanted freedom. The desire for independence was not just a fleeting sentiment, but a growing movement that was beginning to take shape across the country. The streets of India, bustling with activity, were also filled with a sense of unrest and a yearning for change. The British colonial rule, which had been established for over a century, was increasingly being seen as an oppressive force that needed to be challenged. Educated Indians started to question the British rule. These were individuals who had often been educated in British institutions and were well versed in Western political thought and philosophy. They began to see the contradictions between the democratic ideals they had learned about and the reality of British colonialism in India. In classrooms and intellectual circles, discussions about self-governance and rights became more frequent. The educated elite played a crucial role in articulating the grievances of the Indian people and envisioning a future free from British domination. They saw how the British were taking advantage of India. The economic policies imposed by the British were designed to benefit the colonial power at the expense of the Indian populace. Resources were extracted, and local industries were stifled to ensure that India remained a market for British goods. Indian workers toiled under harsh conditions, and the wealth generated from their labor was siphoned off to Britain. This exploitation was not just economic, but also cultural, as the British sought to impose their values and systems on Indian society. They wanted more rights and a voice in the government. The demand for political representation grew louder as Indians sought to have a say in the decisions that affected their lives. Activists and petitioners began to organize, holding meetings and forming associations to press for their rights. They argued that Indians should be allowed to participate in the legislative process and have a role in the administration of their own country. This was a radical idea at the time, challenging the very foundation of British colonial rule. This led to the creation of many political groups. These groups served as platforms for discussing and promoting the idea of self-rule. They brought together people from different regions and backgrounds, united by a common goal. The formation of these groups marked the beginning of organized political activity in India, laying the groundwork for the larger freedom movement that would follow. They held meetings, drafted petitions, and worked tirelessly to raise awareness about the injustices of British rule. The most important one was the Indian National Congress, or INC. Founded in 1885, the INC became the principal organization leading the charge for Indian independence. It started as a modest gathering of educated Indians, but quickly grew into a powerful political force. The INC provided a structured platform for voicing the aspirations of the Indian people and coordinating efforts to achieve self-governance. Its formation was a significant milestone in the history of India's struggle for freedom. Started in 1885, the INC became the main group fighting for India's freedom. The early meetings of the INC were characterized by passionate debates and discussions about the future of India. Leaders from various parts of the country came together to share their experiences and strategies. The INC's annual sessions became important events, where resolutions were passed and plans were made to advance the cause of independence. The organization played a crucial role in uniting the diverse voices of India into a coherent movement. Dadabhai Nauroji, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, and Feroze Shah Mehta were some of the early leaders. These leaders were not only influential within the INC, but also respected figures in Indian society. They brought with them a wealth of experience and a deep commitment to the cause of Indian self-rule. Nauroji, often referred to as the Grand Old Man of India, was a pioneering figure who tirelessly advocated for Indian rights in the British Parliament. Gokhale and Mehta were also instrumental in shaping the early policies and direction of the INC. They wanted more Indians to be part of the government. The early leaders of the INC believed that meaningful change could only come if Indians were given a greater role in the governance of their own country. They lobbied for increased representation in legislative councils and other administrative bodies. Their efforts were aimed at creating a more inclusive and participatory political system where the voices of Indians could be heard and their interests protected. This was seen as a crucial step towards achieving full independence. They showed how British policies were making India poor. The economic arguments put forth by the early leaders of the INC were compelling and well-researched. They highlighted the drain of wealth from India to Britain and the negative impact of British economic policies on Indian industries and agriculture. These leaders used data and analysis to demonstrate that British rule was not only unjust, but also economically detrimental to India. Their work laid the foundation for a broader critique of colonialism and its effects on Indian society. Nauroji, in his book Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, said that British rule was the reason why India was poor. This seminal work provided a detailed analysis of the economic exploitation of India by the British. Nauroji meticulously documented the ways in which British policies had impoverished India and argued for the need to end colonial rule. His book became a key text for the Indian independence movement, inspiring future generations of leaders and activists to continue the struggle for freedom. At first, the Congress was peaceful. The early strategies of the INC were based on the principles of non-violence and dialogue. They believed that by presenting their case rationally and respectfully, they could persuade the British to grant more rights and autonomy to Indians. Peaceful protests, petitions, and negotiations were the primary tools used by the INC in its early years. This approach was rooted in a belief in the power of reason and moral persuasion to bring about change. They tried to talk to the British and ask for change. Delegations of Indian leaders frequently traveled to meet with British officials, both in India and in Britain, to present their demands. These meetings were often marked by polite but firm discussions about the need for reforms. The INC leaders hoped that by engaging in dialogue, they could convince the British government to make concessions and gradually move towards self-governance. However, these efforts were met with limited success. They hoped for slow changes and more control within the British Empire. The early leaders of the INC were pragmatic in their approach, recognizing that immediate independence was unlikely. Instead, they aimed for incremental changes that would increase Indian participation in governance and reduce the arbitrary exercise of colonial power. They believed that by working within the system, they could gradually build the foundations for a future independent India. This strategy reflected a cautious optimism about the possibility of achieving change through reform. But the British government didn't listen. Despite the reasoned arguments and peaceful methods of the INC, the British authorities were largely unresponsive to their demands. The colonial government was more interested in maintaining its control over India than in addressing the grievances of its subjects. Petitions were ignored, and requests for reforms were dismissed. This intransigence on the part of the British government led to growing frustration and disillusionment among Indian leaders and the broader population. More and more people wanted freedom. As the British continued to ignore the demands for reform, the call for complete independence began to gain traction. The idea of self-rule, once considered radical, started to resonate with a larger segment of the Indian population. Mass gatherings and protests became more common, and the nationalist movement began to gather momentum. The desire for freedom was no longer confined to the educated elite, but was spreading to all sections of society. Things were about to change. The early calls for freedom had set the stage for a more intense and widespread struggle for independence. The growing nationalist sentiment and the increasing willingness of the Indian people to challenge British rule signaled a new phase in the freedom movement. The foundations laid by the early leaders and the INC would soon be built upon by a new generation of activists and revolutionaries, leading to a full-fledged fight for India's independence. In 1905, Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India, decided to divide Bengal in two. This decision was not just a simple administrative change, it was a move that would have far-reaching consequences for the Indian subcontinent. Bengal at that time was a large and populous province, and Curzon argued that splitting it would make governance more efficient. However, the real motives behind this decision were far more insidious. He said it was to make things easier to manage. The British administration claimed that the division would lead to better governance and more effective administration. They presented it as a benevolent act aimed at improving the lives of the people in Bengal. But the people of Bengal saw through this facade. But really, he wanted to weaken the growing movement for freedom. The British were becoming increasingly wary of the rising tide of nationalism in India. By dividing Bengal, they hoped to disrupt the unity of the Indian people and weaken the burgeoning freedom movement. This was a classic strategy of divide and rule. Bengal was a center of the freedom movement. The province was a hotbed of nationalist activity, with many prominent leaders and activists hailing from the region. The people of Bengal were at the forefront of the struggle for independence, and the British knew that weakening Bengal would deal a significant blow to the overall freedom movement. By dividing the province based on religion, the British hoped to create problems between Hindus and Muslims. They drew a line through the heart of Bengal, creating East Bengal with a Muslim majority and West Bengal with a Hindu majority. This was a deliberate attempt to sow discord and create religious tensions, thereby diverting attention from the freedom struggle. But this made Indians even angrier. Instead of weakening the freedom movement, the partition of Bengal ignited a wave of protests and resistance. People from all walks of life came together to oppose the division, seeing it as an affront to their unity and identity. Everyone saw it as an attack on India's culture and unity. The partition was not just a political maneuver, it was an attack on the very fabric of Indian society. It threatened to tear apart the cultural and social bonds that had held the people of Bengal together for centuries. The Swadeshi movement started because of this. The anger and resentment against the partition gave birth to the Swadeshi movement, a powerful campaign that called for the boycott of British goods and the promotion of Indian-made products. It was a way for the people to assert their economic independence and resist colonial rule. It asked people to stop buying British goods and to buy Indian products instead. The movement encouraged people to reject foreign goods and embrace local products, thereby weakening the economic hold of the British on India. It was a call to revive traditional industries and support local artisans and craftsmen. People from all over India joined in. The Swadeshi movement quickly spread beyond Bengal, inspiring people across the country to join the cause. It became a nationwide campaign, uniting people from different regions, religions, and backgrounds in a common struggle against colonial rule. They stopped buying British clothes, salt, and other things. The boycott was comprehensive, targeting a wide range of British goods. People stopped buying British textiles, salt, sugar, and other products, opting instead for locally made alternatives. This not only hurt the British economically, but also boosted the morale of the Indian people. They started using khadi, cloth made in India, to show they could take care of themselves. Khadi, a hand-spun and hand-woven cloth, became a symbol of self-reliance and resistance. By wearing khadi, people demonstrated their commitment to the Swadeshi ideals and their determination to break free from British economic dominance. Leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Bipin Chandra Pal, and Lala Lajpat Rai, known as Lal Bal Pal, helped spread this movement. These leaders were instrumental in mobilizing the masses and spreading the message of Swadeshi. They traveled across the country, delivering powerful speeches and organizing rallies to inspire people to join the movement. They wanted complete freedom, or Swaraj. The ultimate goal of the Swadeshi movement was not just economic independence, but complete political freedom. The leaders of the movement called for Swaraj, or self-rule, and urged the people to fight for their right to govern themselves. The Swadeshi movement was very important. It was a turning point in India's struggle for independence, marking the beginning of a new phase of mass mobilization and resistance. The movement demonstrated the power of collective action and the potential of economic boycotts as a tool of political protest. It made Indians feel united and showed them they could be independent. The Swadeshi movement fostered a sense of unity and solidarity among the Indian people. It showed them that they could stand up to the British and take control of their own destiny. It was a powerful affirmation of their identity and their right to self-determination. It helped prepare for even bigger movements for freedom in the future. The Swadeshi movement laid the groundwork for future struggles for independence. It inspired a new generation of leaders and activists, and its legacy continued to influence the freedom movement in the years to come. The lessons learned and the spirit of resistance cultivated during this period would prove invaluable in the final push for India's independence.